Good evening, everyone. How are you guys doing? Awesome. We are really happy to have you here. My name is Mohammed Amin Abdishukri, and I am the production manager, digital and publishing at Debunk Media. And I want to thank you so much, all of you, for joining us tonight, a night of literary camaraderie, a night of appreciating and celebrating great writing and great storytelling. Now, any avid and voracious reader, such as myself, will tell you this. It is far more interesting and delightful to read a faithful, honest, sincere, thoughtful, and tender account of a writer's experiences, of a writer's stories, than reading anything else. And this first issue of Debunk Quarterly has exactly that. And what this group of writers here on this stage have done exceeded our wildest expectations, our wildest imaginations. I'm sure the audience today is a cultured and cultivated audience, folks who find beautiful meanings in beautiful writing. I guarantee you this, and you can come for me afterwards. You will appreciate this, you will relish it, you will savor it, you will enjoy it. And listen, I'm not just saying this because I work at Debunk, and I'm wearing a salesman's hat right now. But beyond the aesthetic quality in the form of the beautiful writing here, there's also a social utility in this publication. And like all great writing, this magazine will act as a mirror and reveal to you, the reader, parts of yourself. So prepare to be enriched, prepare to be enthused, and most importantly, if you haven't yet, prepare to part away with 2,000 shillings and buy this book. One thing about this group of writers is that they are a mixture of veteran writers and newbie writers. There's some people on this stage today, this is their first time ever writing. But if you read the book, you'll be forgiven to think that everyone in there is a seasoned writer with decades of experience under their belt. Why? Because they all deserve to be in this anthology. So I'll do a very brief introduction of our writers. I'll start with the far end. We have Kiprop Kimutai, Nairobi-based writer who was shortlisted for the Miles Moreland Scholarship, the James Baldwin Writer in Residence. Kiprop no kona mafans tayari. The Gerald Crack Award, and he was the second runners-up for the Kwani Manuscript Project for his manuscript, The Water Spirits. Next to him, we have Dr. Goldsmith, Osama Goldsmith. He's an American researcher and writer who has lived in Kenya for over 40 years. Dr. Goldsmith has he has one of the greatest grasps of the historical backgrounds of coastal and northern Kenya areas, and his work appears in various publications, including Kwani. Next to Osama, we have a very good friend of mine, Dale Abraham. Dale is a writer and researcher from Marsabit County, and his non-fiction essays have been published in Chimurenga Chronic, Kwani, Other Stories, Down River Road, and Errant Journal. Next to Dale, we have Wanja Michuki. Wanja is a family enterprise coach, consultant, advisor, and she's also an intuitive energy healer. But for tonight, Wanja is a writer. She's a writer and a storyteller who will present to us her first ever published piece. Next to Wanja, we have Asha Ahmed Mwilu. Wow, I can see some of you looking at me like, yeah, we know who Asha is. Move on to the next person. But I'll not do that. And trust me, by the end of this evening, you'll realize that you really don't know Asha. But for now, I'll introduce Asha as an award-winning journalist who spent more than a decade weaving intricate stories of people and their relationship to power through reportage, investigations, and documentary filmmaking. But tonight, Asha is here as a writer who has written her own intricate story. Next to Asha, we have another veteran journalist, A.K. Kaiser. Kaiser is a Ugandan writer and journalist who joined the media in 1994. Half the audience weren't born, I think. Kaiser has worked for a number of years at the former Uganda Television and for some time at the East African newspaper as a reporter at large, but he's also a pioneering arts and literary journalist and critic. He has worked in Kenya as a literary editor for Kwani, as well as editor of the online arts magazine African Colors. Next to Kaiser, we have Hadassah Saya. Hadassah, in her own words, is a reader happiest when lost in a good story. Hadassah is also, Hadassah is also a writer whose works have been featured in Picture Narratives Kenya and now in Debunk Quarterly 001. And last, but most definitely not least, next to Hadassah, we have Diana Chepkemoi. Diana is currently halfway through her bachelor's degree in arts education at the Meru University of Science and Technology. Diana is a fighter, she's a conqueror who broke national and international news. More on that as we continue with our session tonight. But for tonight, again, for the first time ever, Diana is crowned a writer, and this is the first story she's ever written. I'm going to take a breath, so you can give them another warm round of applause. Kiprop, I want to start with you. Could you kindly give us a brief synopsis of your story? Very brief, and then from there you can do your reading.
First of all, I just want to appreciate each one of you for coming here to listen to us read and for buying our stories. So, my name is Kiprop Kimutai. I wrote A Stranger in St. Paul de Vence, and it's basically about being in this small village. I went for a residence in the village that James Baldwin spent the last 2 decades of his life. So it's more a reflection of trying to walk through his footsteps to see how he took up space in this very conservative part of France, and also my own experiences there as well as an African in a conservative part of France. So it's a nice read. I walked on past the dry riverbed and up its other side. I thrust through an endlessness of shrubs, marveling how I was all alone in the forest. I felt a mischievous thrill that I was an African walking by myself in the wilds of Europe, but the forest was deceiving and tiring, leading me to what seemed to be its end, only to repeat itself. More trees, more winding paths to walk through. Finally, I saw a windmill and an old house, and I walked to it. Past it was the tarmac road, which was wide and seemed to lead on, and definitely not to Tourette's. I walked along till I discovered a footpath that ran against it to a section of run-down houses with goats tied outside and chickens clucking about. I looked up and saw Tourette's, rising with postcard picture gloriousness on a jutting piece of rock with a wondrous, fairly complete Roman aqueduct reaching towards it from the valley beside the rock. But I couldn't, for the life of me, see a path that would lead me to it. I retraced my steps and meandered about, hoping I had enough of a repository of French to ask for directions. I saw a woman step out of a gate, and I shouted a bonjour at her, followed by a request in halting and obviously terrible French on how I could get to Tourette's. She froze and stepped back inside her gate, closing it. I wondered if she was scared of seeing a black man, as a number of people had generously been in one Parisian night. But then she opened the gate and walked out with a tall black man with long, grayed locks of hair. The man walked to me and said he spoke little English, gesturing negatively with his hands. We tried what we could once more, speaking over our phones, which marvelously failed with the translations. A young girl of secondary school age and presumably the woman's daughter walked over. She said she was now learning English in school and could listen to me better. But she was yet to learn enough English to direct someone lost outside her home and wanting to get to Tourette's. Finally, the man gestured the act of turning on the engine to a bike and said repeatedly, "Scooter, scooter." I nodded avidly, and minutes later, I was behind him on his scooter as he winded up the tarmac road, round and round, till we reached the rocky rampart where the passage leading inside Tourette's stood. He parked his scooter and pointed at the town, saying in English, "This is what you want." The man folded his hands and stepped closer, asking me where I was from. His hair was gray, but he looked youthful and fit. He seemed beyond age, as if, as we say in Kenya, he had eaten life enough to stand outside its silly timelines. I told him I was from Kenya, and he asked if I had heard of Martinique, and I said and said that's where he was from. He paused before gesturing a sign of openness with his hands and told me the fact I was Kenyan and he from Martinique didn't matter. We are African, black people, and lifting one finger, one country.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful passage, and I appreciate that you selected it. So, just looking back at you writing this story, you're granted this prestigious residency given to black writers across the world who write in the spirit of James Baldwin. And I must say, having read your work, you do write in the spirit of James Baldwin, and you also do write in the style of James Baldwin. Now, the question is, how did the Baldwin residency and, interacting with the people who knew Baldwin and connecting with his writings and his perspectives on race and identity, how did this influence your own responses to the subtle and overt racism that you faced there?
Well, I think it was a beautiful experience getting to meet people who called Baldwin a friend, in the sense that all my life, we've all seen Baldwin and we see him on YouTube, on TV and whatnot, and is this intellectual, like, snapping back at people with like very intelligent arguments. But then you meet people who drank with him, sang with him, met the guy who translated his telegrams, this young lady who would kind of aid him when he was walking back home, maybe a little drunk. So he became human to me. But then at the same time, he was also large, like he passed on like in the 80s, but people in that town still remember him fondly. So somehow as a black man coming from a foreign country, coming to France, learning French, and being loved. He was actually loved by the people in that village, and it just made me wonder what kind of a person he was to be able to take space that way. Because for me, I kind of wallowed in self-pity because I felt my smallness a lot. And to sort of just imagine that Baldwin was here. He was different from me, but okay, we share the same skin color. I kind of just had an imagination of how I could possibly move around and come into myself, despite everything around me trying to make me feel small.
And you vividly described moments of connection and disconnection with the locals. I mean, the passage you read right now is a beautiful example of the connection that you had from the gentleman from Martinique, and how, no matter where we are in the world, we're black people, we're Africans, we're one people, right? But there are also moments of disconnect, moments that you mentioned in this piece where, you're trying to catch a train and someone just snubs you based on the color of your skin and whatnot. So the question is, how did these experiences of seeing the same locals in the same places, shape your understanding of community and isolation in a foreign land?
First of all, I would say that I had very many beautiful experiences. This wasn't like a sad experience overall. I met so many wonderful people, and I guess what allowed me to meet people was that I walked a lot. I kind of just wanted to understand the geography around me. To if there's a hill, I climb it. If it's to go to the ocean, I go to the ocean. And I can't exactly remember your question, but but
I
I
understand.
walked a lot.
That thing that you mentioned right now about walking, let me shift to that. One of our writers for Debunk Quarterly is not here, unfortunately, Clifton Gashagwa, but you'll read his piece. It's a beautiful piece titled Inheriting Burning Libraries. And one of the things that he writes in that piece is he quotes so many writers. That book itself is like an appendix. That story is like an appendix of its own. So of the many writers that he quotes is the writer Walter Benjamin. And I found that interesting because Walter Benjamin was in a way obsessed with 19th century Paris, and especially he was obsessed with the French poet Charles Baudelaire. And through Charles Baudelaire, Benjamin explored the concept of the flaneur, the urban wanderer who experiences, observes, and interprets the city in his own unique ways. Now, of course, Clifton, who wrote this story, is a flaneur in his own right, who's walked around Nairobi and whatnot. I want to bring another writer to this conversation, Kaiser. You mentioned in your piece how you too, at some point, became a flaneur in Kampala, and that helped you observe the city more and piece together its history. Same with you, Kiprop. During your residency, you just told us that there were moments when you aimlessly walked around, discovering and interpreting this foreign land. So my question to the two of you is, how important is it for a writer to double as a flaneur from time to time?
I think it's essential in the sense that landscape is integral to story because we exist in physical spaces. We have our consciousness and our metaphysical, but the physical space, the dust, the ground, the trees, the roads, the people, everything around you, you're a human in a body, and that body has to exist in a physical space. So for you to write and reinterpret the world, you have to understand that you are there as a body moving through a physical space. So I always try to walk around in whichever space I'm in because I think that's essential to even understanding everything that is internal. I have to see everything that is external. It kind of creates a structure for me.
Kaiser?
I think for me, two things. One from a purely organizing capacity that when you walk, somehow the rhythm helps you to organize your mind. So there's a meditative quality that comes from that, right? When you're writing, there are very many complex things that you're dealing with. And being able, walking helps you just to pace your mind. In the past, I always walked with a notebook. I walk with my phone, and any thought that comes in, I note it down. That's just a practical part of being a writer. But the second one is what Kim Tai talked about, your body moving through space. Now, for me, walking through the streets of Kampala helped to ground me in the history of that space. In a way, I wanted to walk through the same kind of space that the people who shaped my past did. That took me away from it closed the distance because when you read reading is great, right? But if you're a writer, there is the materiality of what you're looking for, and so it put me in that. It took me to another time. Geography, time was always moving, but geography stands still. And I think that was very, very important for me to see the world in its primary form, in the unmediated form. Yes.
I love that.
Thank you.
And now's a great time to tell us about your story. A Violent Birth of Kampala. What a title. So give us a quick synopsis of the story, and maybe you can select your reading.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank everybody who came up here. It's really a great honor. And Nairobi has a special place in my heart. When I came to Nairobi, I was running away from Kampala and I was running away from what my journalism had done. I can see some faces here. People who really helped me. Hi, Tabu. Hi, Isaac. People who helped me to navigate a very difficult period. They didn't know they were doing it, but they were doing it. They had that much grace in them to do that. Now, what I've written here is my experience of Kampala, the city. You know, there is the city itself, but it's also what it stood for and what it meant. You know, there is a history of the city which is very long, but then there is a history of the colonial city as this kind of machine that churned out who we are. You know, I wasn't born in the city. I first came to Kampala in 1980s. The place scared me. It continued to scare me for a long time. Walking was a way for me to unscare myself. Yeah. So what I've written here is, in a way, my return to writing. Because when I left Nairobi, by the time I was leaving Nairobi, I was already in this crisis. I was doing literary and art criticism as an African. But the more the questions deepened, the more I realized I didn't know Africa, because I'd gone to missionary schools, colonial schools, where they didn't teach your own culture. So I took time off to ground myself in Africanness. And traveling through Kampala helped me a lot. And so for me, what I wrote here was, in a way, trying to share the process by which I uncolonized myself and re-Africanized myself. Yeah, so it may not convey that, but what it does is, I hope, take the reader through the difficulties of what it means to be a Ugandan and a Ugandan writer.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Can I read now?
Yes.
I never set out to dig this deep into the history of Kampala. As a northern Ugandan, my knowledge of the city and of southern Uganda was at the surface. As with any post-colonial citizen, there were only the ethnic stereotypes of the South for me, of the South and of Southerners for me to go on. Because colonial education never taught colonial history. You know, again, much has already been written about these matters already. People have written about Kampala, and it's been done many times, and by better people, better informed. But the passing of the neoliberal era, which we are currently witnessing painfully, made the past of its antecedent, the quote-unquote liberal era, more urgent. The more years are spent studying social and cultural transformation under colonial rule, the more certain elements began to look familiar. Now that the end of the neoliberal era is in sight, certain similarities in how Uganda has been governed since the structured adjustment policies of the Bretton Woods Institutes link up with how it was under the less understood liberal era, which was the effective economic ideology of colonialism. You talk of neocolonialism, colonialism, neoliberalism, yeah. As neoliberalism was for, there were the similarities were too provocative. I just had to write this piece. The parallels between Sir Apollo Kagwa, a name that one ought to know, and Yoweri Museveni coming to power militarily under British support, the idea that Nilotic people were mortal enemies of Bantu people, even though centuries of migration and intermarriages had blurred the lines, had helped the British use Apollo Kagwa in the 1880s and 90s to destroy Bunyoro Kitara and to help Museveni to destroy northern Uganda. Neither Apollo Kagwa nor Museveni fully understood their own wars, but this was and is the practice of divide and rule. The forcing of freewheeling capitalism on native populations, the use of warfare as a political tool, the use of Kampala City as a military force against neighboring states, all bear the hallmark of a similar imperial mind frame. The expansion of Kampala City in the 1890s and 1920s from Kampala Hill into Nakasero under Apollo Kagwa's watch, and from Kampala City into northern Kampala, now under Museveni, follow a similar trajectory of land grabbing. The personal crisis that pushed me to study Kampala began in my budding years as a journalist and writer. Writing had flung me into the cultural and metaphysical chasm of Uganda. As a writer, or any reader well knows, long prose is the metal detector par excellence of buried histories. Writing requires the wealth of heritage as material for its structure and language. Grammar and tenses literally depend on the past, like past tense. But here you were, a black citizen of Kampala City. Barely a generation knew into what used to be bad to your grandparents, and you were expected to have already fit into the city, not built for your own culture. One of the most important clues that they did not want us Africans in this city was that space had existed for European, Arab, and Asian religious beliefs, but not for Africans. There are no temples for African religions in these colonial cities. We naturally came to believe, therefore, that only African religions were satanic, because the city planners granted no room for our worship, for our belief. At a practical level, the city remained a closed book for me. The schools were mum, quiet about the violence and collaborations, which mealy-mouthed descriptions called and still do development. The crucial records of colonial rule had been evacuated by the British towards the end of colonial rule. We lived in absolute Napoleon ignorance as black people. You tried to write and found the subject matter missing. And so the decision to walk through every accessible street of Kampala came to me gradually, building up through the decade from 2004 to 2014, when I began to do it in earnest. Thank you.
That's a lot. You know, when the first time Isaac had approached me about moderating this event and whatnot, and I started reading these pieces, I was like, no, we can't do one event. Each writer deserves their own event. Because that passage that you've read, I have so many questions about them. The first one is, you draw these intriguing parallels between the governance styles and policies of Apollo Kagwa, and who was, the architect of collaboration during colonial times, and President Yoweri Museveni, particularly in terms of the military support, the land grabbing, and the expansion of Kampala, as you've read. So how do these comparisons inform our understanding of Uganda's political and social landscape today?
It is a question I'm trying to answer for myself. But what was so striking for me was the similarities were just mind-boggling. Apollo Kagwa was what in southern Uganda and Buganda was called the Katikiro, a chief minister, the man who controlled the administrative affairs of the state below the king, the Kabaka. Very, very powerful figures, absolutely powerful figures, because they control access to the king. And he was a convert to Christianity, to Protestantism, Anglicanism. So he was a leader of that faction. They were the Catholics, and Islam had come to Uganda much earlier, Kampala, Terminologies, there was no Kampala then, there was Uganda, it meant different things. Yeah. But, Apollo Kagwa had, with the help of a lot of missionaries, these missionaries carried guns. They called them, muscular Christians. They carried guns. They did, right? So there was struggle between the factions of Buganda who had converted to Catholicism and Protestantism, and those who had converted to what, in the terminology of the age, was called Mohammedanism. There had to be an ism somewhere. Yeah, but because basically Britain had been granted this territory under the General Act of Berlin, known in common language as the Scramble of Africa, so Apollo Kagwa was helped by the British in surreptitious ways to grab power. So he became the Katikiro, the prime minister, in the mid-1880s. And Mr. Museveni becomes president in the mid-1980s. And the more I looked at it was, Apollo Kagwa was enforcing free-wheeling capitalism on the native populations. Like give land to the investors, do this and that and that. He was a popular man in the British press. And since Museveni became president, this land grabbing came back. Capital, investors are good people, give it to them. And he was very popular in the West. This struck me, and I was like, well, let me look a bit more into this. And I realized that at the time, the most powerful opposition to British intrusion into what is today Uganda came from Bunyoro Kitara, which in its a complicated way had also been, and the British going through Apollo Kagwa destroyed this place through a murderous genocide which was never reported by the good media of the West. Certain things never change. And again, post-independence, the destruction of northern Uganda was done the same. I began to look at it. And, these things started to pile up. Expanding from this small hill in Kampala called Kampala Hill, land was grabbed, extending here. And lots of Africans were pushed out. We only talk about Idi Amin's economic war. Or, I think a lot of the Asian traders were compensated for losing their property in Uganda. But the Africans who had been pushed out to make way for these businesses were never compensated. And in a similar way, a lot of Africans in the last 30 years being pushed out of their lands are not compensated. These similarities just struck me, and I felt cold. I felt that if we don't know our history, others are going to repeat it on us.
Beautiful. Before I move on to another writer, I just want to ask one more question, Kaiser. This is one of my favorite lines from your piece, and you just read it. Quote, "As any writer or reader well knows, long prose is the metal detector par excellence of buried histories. It requires the wealth of heritage as material for its structure, and language, grammar, and tenses depend on the past." Literally. What responsibility do you believe writers have in shaping the historical memory of a place or event, especially one with a contentious and painful past like Kampala?
If we were not in this room, a lot of writers would be running after you with very unkind intentions. I come from a generation of writers. We were really pumped up and very energetic, wanting to do things. A few years later, people ask you, where are the books? Let me tell you one thing. When you want to start writing long prose, there's one thing you run into. It's not enough to write well. It's not enough to fire off that sentence, It's not enough to be clever. In a way, writers, we are the shamans of our society. We are people, I don't want to use the word which talked about, we are in that territory where the metaphysical, the spiritual meets the physical, right? And as a writer, the more I tried to write long prose, I could write good sentences, but I didn't know my society. I didn't know what I was writing about. I didn't even know the meaning of my name. So the more I started to try to write, the more I discovered that the history and the society, the social ambience I needed to talk about in my book wasn't there. And it's almost like you try to do something like long prose. It's like going through many oceans and then coming back and arriving at the same conclusion that, oh my God, colonialism is real. Yeah. So for me, I really needed to break this thing down. Like I said, I used to write about African art without knowing what is the creative ethos of being an African. How did an African artist create African art? What is the principle? All I had was the education I received about Florence and perspective and Michelangelo. I felt ashamed of myself. I really did. And so I didn't shut this thing down necessarily. I went out to find what is our theology. What happens to the soul of the black person under African religion? I needed to know these things. But the missionary education told me not to look at that. So anyway, the good news, I think my writing improved after I knew a few things here and there. Thank you. The book is coming.
That is a promise you made in front of God and men. So we'll hold you accountable to that when the book comes.
It's a commitment.
Perfect. If you read Kaiser's piece, you'll see what I'm talking about, because he seems to draw on various disciplines. He draws on history, he draws on anthropology, urban studies, in a way, political science. You draw on all these, various disciplines, but you integrate all this diverse perspective into a cohesive, dripping, flowing narrative that's not too rigid, not too academic, and frankly, not too boring. And one other writer that does that, he'll give you heavy stuff, but like in a flowing way, is
You're
Dr.
very kind. Too kind?
is Dr. Osama Goldsmith. So Dr. Osama, you do that as well. You write about a lot, a lot of different subject matters in your stories, but you do it in storytelling, basically. All these various disciplines brought together. So tell us about the story that you wrote for DQ1, Magogoni Before the Port.
I first came to Kenya in 1974 as a field studies program, and I ended up, the first phase of my exploration of Kenya started on the north coast of Kenya, where I did a thesis on the Bajuni Agriculture and Maritime Complex. So my essay tells the story of Magogoni, the site of the Kenya's second port, as it was at that time, and the dynamics under it. So it's partially a story about the Swahili way of life at that time, but it's more a story about Uswahili. When Kenya gained independence in 1963, Amu was the only settlement that still conveyed the former glory and unique Swahili way of life. The archipelago's other towns, Pate, Sio, and Faza, had gone from independent city-states to, in the late 19th century, to isolated backwater outposts. The rise of Mombasa as the primary port for the new colony acted to draw away much of the population economic capital from these former sultanates, a process that continued during the decades following independence. The Bajuni mainland, however, remained relatively stable during the colonial era. The agricultural settlements remained productive. When decline set in, it was sudden and the ramifications were to become much greater than anyone understood at the time. Upon achieving independence, repeated shift of bandit attacks impoverished the prosperous Bajuni settlements. Many of the IDPs returned to their homes, only to suffer more incursions. By 1965, all but a few of the Bajuni inhabiting the area between Mkokoni and Ras Kiamboni had relocated to new villages elsewhere in the district and to Lamu town. When the hostilities formally ended in 1969, by that time the mainland Bajuni had been scattered across the coastal strip and beyond to Tanzania and other places. By the 1970s, however, life was beginning to return to some of the Bajuni mainland settlements. There were around 15 families reestablishing their homes in Rubu, maybe 20 in Mamborde. Mkokoni was a proper village, mainly due to its location to the high-end tourist camp in Stesheni, a creatively constructed lodge situated in the archipelago's most paradisically beautiful niche. This was the site of the Al-Shabaab attack and kidnapping, I think 2016. Okay, but Magogoni was still emerging as the main catchment for Lamu's internally displaced Bajuni. The area of, I tell the story of going and visiting there for the first time, okay? The area of cashew cultivation we passed through during my first visit was in the early stages becoming mashamba. Now in Swahili, mashamba is actually an imported word from Le Champ in French. The indigenous Swahili Bajuni term is konde for a farm, but when it becomes permanent, it becomes shamba, okay? IDPs like Hassan hope to see their homesteads develop into proper farms over time. Magogoni was now representing a new kind of Swahili Mui. Its establishment was proceeding through the settlement of Bajuni and returnees from the Swahili diaspora, their Boni and Orma neighbors, and supposed outsiders like our Kamba visitors over time. Like the peri-urban areas of Nairobi and Mombasa, the ethnically mixed Majengo neighborhoods defining the rise of Kenyan towns and other spaces of multi-ethnic interaction, it was possible to discern how such informal processes were contributing to the emergence of a more cosmopolitan, multicultural Kenya. Coevolution describes how distinct entities interact and mutually adapt to the world they jointly inhabit. Whereas the environment serves as the primary mechanism of selection in conventional evolution, in coevolution, the organization of the system also selects for adaptive traits and behaviors. This enables each agent to tune the structure of its own landscape while forming couplings to other landscapes to its own advantage. This process explains the emergence of urban society in the Sahel and on the Swahili coast. Both names derive from the same term, reflecting slight phonetic variations on the Arabic letter sin. The two regions illustrate how coevolutionary forces molded the urban civilizations arising deep in the interior and the same process along the maritime interface. Much more could be said about this historical dynamic, including examples of how it sustained the process of cultural and technological exchange and syntheses from across the region. For present purposes, however, it will suffice to confirm this process continues to operate, albeit underneath the surface of formal governance in Kenya. Although I did not understand in these terms at the time, I was to witness the unfolding of this process in Magagoni over the following years. Naturally, it involved frictions as the number of settling in Magagoni expanded as the instant following our departure from Hassan's tiny house, homestead illustrated.
Osama, for you to have been able to write about Magogoni, and particularly about the Bajonis, their traditional homestays, the agricultural cycles, the social organization, their displacement, their struggles with banditry, their attempts to rebuild their lives through agriculture and fishing in Magogoni and other settlements. And I must say, you've done a great job of this because you've balanced between portraying their hardships and resilience without romanticizing or oversimplifying their experiences. Now, to do this, to illustrate all of this, you must have had to integrate with the community. But you also maintained an outsider's perspective. So how do you balance these roles in your narrative, these dual perspectives?
The ethnographic method is based on participant observation. So many of my professors said, you passed that line a long time ago. So I became engaged. I worked as a Bajuni fisherman. I've worked as a farmer. I cut mangrove. I spent long nights out on the open ocean. I poled boats, till your arms are about to fall off and things like that. I was young, I'm very healthy, huh? In 1976, also during the first Ramadan I was there, I reverted to Islam. I'd been involved in a lot of spiritual discipline, meditation, yoga, and things like that. So the methodology of Islam fit very much into the direction I was going. So anyway, I became very much part of the society in Lama, which at that time was quite intimate. Everybody knew each other. For me, it was a perfect laboratory to study Islam and other processes like the Usahiri you talk about. So anyway, near the point when I was getting not too far, I was going to leave, my friends of mine said, okay, you've done everything you've done here, you need to get married. Now this was like a foreign concept to me. I had at that point, I had never had even a permanent girlfriend for a long time. And so the idea was set in my head and it grew, and then the friend who's one of the main characters in this story, when you read it, also became like my uncle or father's substitute and started introducing to me people. And so all of a sudden on June 13th, 1976, I was there in the mosque and saying Kabetu, and a whole nother chapter began. So,
He's not finished.
I haven't answered your question yet as such. But one of the fantastic things about Kenya, I think we didn't divert the world into two types of society, open societies and closed society. Kenya is a very open society. Amu, the coast of Kenya, is probably among the most open. So historically, there's people coming from different places, parts of the world, mainly on boats and things, that got off and ended up and going through the same process I did. So once I'm rooted within the society, I have commitments. I'm like a citizen, raia wa Uswahili. I go on and pursue the dynamics of how it operates. So since that time, it's my quest has begin to try to understand and describe and analyze how Kenya operates as a complex system. And I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, and it brings me to my next question. Here you are, 1974, an American in the coast, How did the community of Magogoni and the Bajuni family, Hassan's family, who's in your study, react How did they react to your interest and involvement in their lives? Were there any moments of resistance or skepticism towards your research, and how did you address them?
Actually, I don't think I ever experienced any real barriers. I mean, main problem is because of my complexion, I got a lot of sunburn. But in terms of socially, I don't think there's any second guessing. I have experience, like you're saying, more in northern Kenya, where whether the motives or the incentives, of course, anywhere you go in Kenya, you're going to be accused as being a CIA agent, right? So you get used to that very early in the game. And say, well, if I was really that, I mean, look at the clothes I'm wearing. So, I mean, I really don't get paid enough. But,
Thank you, Osama.
but they were good. They were good. I wasn't the first person to do it. I've been going on for like 1,000 years. So
I get you. Yeah. Moving on to the next writer, because we're coming from a multicultural setting already. We're already there. A multicultural background and whatnot. So sticking with that, I'll go to the next writer, Asha Ahmed Muilu. Your story, just give us a quick synopsis and your reading.
So my story is about my family, actually. The story is called The Dress My Father Bought Me. And I think when you read the story, you will wonder which father. So something happened to me when I was covering the 2017 election as part of KTN. You remember how chaotic that election was, and of course, it ended up at the Supreme Court. So anything that I was doing around the election, I was being accused of siding with one faction, political faction, because of my name, Wilu. And many people thought that the deputy CJ, Philomena Mwilu, is my mother. And so from that point, I really felt that at some point in my life, I want to write about my mother, and I want to write about my father and my other father. And so this is the beginning of that. Having been sort of pushed off the ledge by a friend of mine who said, you must begin to write this story. They know themselves. And so this is the story of my Baba and my dad. The first time I visit Baba in Caliph, after our move with Dad to Savannah, I pack all my 4 dresses and even borrow a few more from my sister for backup. Unlike my sister, who spent most of her childhood in Caliph, fetching water from the communal taps deep in Majengo, and got to witness our parents transition from their madhouse to their 2-bedroom flat in Pumwani high-rise before Ma and Baba's talaka, I am just discovering the inner workings of this place. On the first day, Baba takes out the Quran and asks me to recite Ayatul Kursi. He says it is the most important ayah in the Holy Book. I fluently get through the first 3 lines and then get stuck. Baba's firstborn son from his new marriage, Omari, knows the entire surah. He is 2 years younger than me, and I am embarrassed. Baba notices and quickly steps in to salvage the situation. Ukirudi, usome na ufanye practice. Kila Muislamu ana Quran kwa moyo wake. Kazi ni kuikubali. He says, asking that when I get back to Savannah, I should read and master the Quran, that every Muslim is born with it in their hearts, and their task is to accept it. Baba then switches on the TV to watch the news. You have to know what's happening in the world, he instructs. And now I want to know as many things as he does. Maybe I want to impress him. Maybe I want to be like him. And so I make a point to religiously watch the lunchtime bulletin, even when Baba isn't home. He doesn't have to be present for me to do as he wishes. In the evening, Baba takes me to the nearby Riyadh Mosque for Maghrib prayers. I am wearing my buibui, and once we get to the mosque, he hands me over to a woman who chaperones me at the women-only section of the masjid. Your grandfather built this mosque, Baba tells me. I believe him. Everyone here calls him by a moniker, which means the Sheikh's son. Grandpa was the Sheikh. After the 20-minute prayer, Baba and I reunite outside the mosque, and walk hand in hand to Gikomba, an open-air market next to the mosque. The market's tight and muddy corridors are littered with bales of second-hand clothing with a distinct smell. As we snake through the stalls, all the vendors seem to know my Baba, but they call him different names whose meanings will take me decades to decode. In the middle of one corridor, Baba and I squeeze into one of the smaller stalls. A man chewing mira exchanges pleasantries with Baba, then tells us he has Vitu Moto Moto. The man pulls out a pair of blue and white Reebok sneakers and tells us those are Reebok pumps. He and Baba proceed to tussle over the price as Baba scrutinizes every corner of the shoe. Hii ni ile original? Baba asks. Is the sole intact? Does it have any scratches? Are the insoles okay? In the end, a firm handshake seals the deal as Baba and I walk away with the shoes. No money exchanges hands. Huyo ni mtu wangu Joe, Baba tells me as we walk back home. That's his homeboy. When we get to the house, Baba plays Bob Marley. I remember every dance step. Point your fingers up, move your shoulders forward, then backward. My brother Omari joins in, and his mother, our mother, smiles in the kitchen. Drop your hands and swing side to side. Slow down even more until the song ends. Baba then turns into the funniest comedian, sending us into fits of laughter. The evening ends with Baba's magic tricks, and after dinner, Baba tells us to recite our Isha prayers, then head to bed. Baba and Mama Omari lend me their bedroom, where I sleep alone. They share a mattress on the living room floor. It's a lot for me. I close my eyes and try to recite Ayatul Kursi under my breath. I think.
Beautiful. Asha, as someone who's worked with you for the past year or so, I felt this piece revealed to me that I knew nothing about you. Because you're a very, secretive person, a mysterious person, if I may say. And I suspect there are many people who have known you for way longer than I have, who will read this piece and also realize that they don't know you. The first question that I want to ask you is, how did your, multicultural background, coupled with the global and local culture, the culture influences that you write about, that you grew up with, things like music and cuisine, how did that influence your sense of identity growing up? And how has that sense of identity evolved since?
Okay, so I don't think growing up I thought about identity a lot. Because I came from a blended family. When my mom and my baba got their talaka, their divorce, my mom remarried the banker called Mwilu. And so this story oscillates from these two locations. Mwilu moves us to a neighborhood called Savannah in Donholm back in the 90s. And these two men were very similar, very different, and also had some similarities. My baba introduced me to Bob Marley, and I love Bob Marley to date. And he also watched the news a lot. He still does. And so when we meet, we talk a lot about news. It's like, have you watched Al Jazeera? What's happening in Gaza? And when I do my stories, Baba will call me and be like, you missed this point, So of course, obviously now, looking back, you do see the sort of influence that people around you growing up had on you. Then Mwilu was this very eccentric guy. He rode a motorcycle to work. He kept an afro. Sometimes my mom would, blow his hair out and he'd plait cornrows. He'd go fishing with his friends. He loved the arts and culture. We grew up listening to a lot of music because of him. So lots of rumba. To date, my mom has kept his rumba CDs and vinyls. So I'm a record collector. And I used to think, oh, I'm so cool. But I'm not, because I collect records, I listen to music, I read books because of that introduction from him, right? I enjoy classical music sometimes. And going back to Dad's archives, I saw Beethoven, and I'm like, oh, okay, this is where it came from, right? You usually feel like you're the one who's formed sort of like this identity that you've become, but it's a lot of like bits and pieces, and it's not just from your parents, right? It's like this friend who reads a certain book, or a friend who owns poetry, and then all of a sudden, you know, you come across a poem online and you're like, oh, I love poetry. But it's these little influences that sort of like trickle to you as a human being and that form your identity. But beyond that, it's, and this is what I'm exploring a lot now, it's lost identities. As someone who has a mixed heritage, I do feel a sense of like loss, because you know, some of my friends speak their mother tongue. I can't. And that's because of existing in very different spaces. So, you know, my Baba and I are now trying to find out who my grandfather really was and where he came from. He's this guy who seems to have been from Palestine, went through Jordan, then found himself in Somalia, and then in colonial Kenya came to Nairobi, in Pumwani, marries this woman, my maternal grandmother, who is Ngazija from Comoros Island. And so Baba already is complex. And then he meets my mom, whose mother is from Bukoba in Tanzania, and the father is from somewhere in Kenya. And these two then have me and my sister. And so, you know, when now you're all grown up, and of course because of the trajectory of my life, you don't really think about these things. So when I spoke to this friend of mine who urged me to write this story, they were always like, you know that's strange, right? Like, people are not Ngazija and Palestinian and Kamba and, you know, Haya from Bukoba. People don't have such, like, very complex, you know, mixed identities. And so I think I haven't really thought about it much over the last 35 years of my life, but now I am.
Brilliant. And Asha, writing such a personal, nostalgic, writing all poignant stories really, it often involves revisiting memories. If you read Asha's piece and maybe you grew up in the 90s, you'll be like, yeah, I remember this, you know. It is so nostalgic. How did you approach the process of digging through these memories? And what strategies did you use to maintain emotional balance while writing?
I wish I had like a very intellectual answer, like Kaiser, you know, and say that I was a flaneur and I walked around the streets of Nairobi, but I didn't do that, right? I think I'm generally a very inward person. Yeah, some of my friends will be like, but I am. I think I had to unpack a lot of compartments and memories, and they were quite painful, some of them, because of course in the story you realize what happened to Dad, for example, and that was a very painful thing to write about. And I don't like going into those spaces, and that's why I love to listen to music or to now read the Quran and things like that. But my process was really just right. And because of the encouragement of my editor, it was just right, and the memories will flow. So for me, the writing was very, very organic. The bits that I couldn't remember, I think my family knows I sat with them. I made my mom remember a lot of things on my behalf. I spoke to my dad. And then I opened Pandora's box, because now he thinks we're doing this really big project together. But that was my process. It was really just write and unlock certain memories that you've locked away. My best writing happened, I think, 2 days. when I allowed myself to be open and to go to places that I don't usually allow myself to go. And of course, vulnerability. So I'm not mysterious. I think I'm just private. So that was the big decision I had to make to break privacy.
Brilliant. Now, yeah, yeah. Another writer on this stage whose accuracy of memories I was impressed by, and who a lot of the events that they write about was so vivid, palpable nostalgia, personal events that happened decades ago but captured also beautifully and so accurately, is Wanja Michuki. Wanja, could you take us through your story, a synopsis and a quick reading?
Yes, sure. Thank you. So my story is titled Going Back into the Pool, and it's a story about my relationship with water, and in particular, my relationship with water in pools, in water bodies, because water to me is it's almost holy. And this started from my experience as a kid, starting swimming at Musangari in the baby pool, which was my most joyous place. So this is something I never forgot. I never forgot the experience of that, and then evolving as a swimmer. But in the backdrop of this was also my life happening. And the pool was sort of my calming, cleansing ground. It was a place where I experienced connection with the divine. So going back into the pool begins in the baby pool, and then it comes full circle to my life as an adult and going back to the pool that my father built after falling out with my siblings when my dad died, when my parents died. And it was going back to the pool was like a process of healing. And I didn't know that at that point. I had sort of, there was some intervening years where I hadn't kept up my relationship with the pool. But when I went back, it was like a crescendo of dealing with what had been going on throughout that time. So it's a story about water. It's also a story about my relationship with my father. It's a story about my own internal world, like just knowing myself. It's a story about my relationship with the Creator, with the divine, with God. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Your first reading, please. Before Wanja starts, I'll give you guys a heads up. Wanja's piece happens to be the longest in the magazine. It's 13,418 words, divided into 3 main parts. Yeah. Just so you know. Yes. Yes. Her first published piece, yeah.
Thank you. So I'm reading from page 88. One day, my mother pulled me out of training unexpectedly, saying it was too much of a bother and that I wouldn't swim with the team anymore. My swim teacher had a word with her, but my mother was adamant. At this point, I had only butterfly left to qualify for the amateur championships. I was top of my class in academics, and I couldn't make out what the issue was. Previously, my mother had gotten my hair cut because she said it was too much to take care of with swimming. I didn't resist then or now. My opinions about my hair or swimming were not solicited, and I didn't have the language or agency to refuse. I also didn't allow myself to feel the disappointment of this. What would I do with it if I did? 2 school terms went by without me training, and then out of the blue, after a regular swimming lesson, my teacher approached me saying the championships were coming and the team needed a swimmer for the relay, and I was the only one he could think of to join the existing team. My mother had been clear about me not swimming, her word final, and so I asked him to speak to her. Whatever he said, My teacher's intervention worked because my mother allowed me to swim in this particular championship. It was important because aside from the relay, I was also registered for the 25 meters butterfly. Unknowns to me, the 4th All Africa Games were scheduled to be held in Nairobi the following year, and to participate, I needed to qualify for the amateur championships. The day came, and it was a huge meet at Aga Khan High School. The older boys and girls were competing, and whenever they were there, it was the big leagues. There were swimmers from the likes of Aga Khan Mombasa, Rift Valley Academy, Hospital Hill, and St. Mary's School. I arrived at the venue at lunch break because I had to get my photo taken for a passport that morning. It was 1985, and I was about to go on my first cross-border trip to Zambia using my own passport. I wore my swimsuit underneath my clothes because I sensed I would have to rush for my race once I got to Aga Khan. I was not happy with this photo-taking arrangement, as there was a real risk of me missing my races. It made no sense to me why it couldn't have been planned for another day. My displeasure was captured in the photo. I was just in time for my heats, which were organized by age. The Musangari team was on the benches to the left of the pool, closer to the deep end. My teacher was pacing up and down, holding the schedule in his clipboard, whistle hanging from his neck or in his mouth, calling out our names, psyching us up. I was worried because I hadn't trained, but he encouraged me, telling me I would be fine. The loudspeaker was on. 25 meters butterfly, blah, 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 Michuki. My race was called. I needed to pee and I was up for a swim. I remember at some point before the word go, I stopped hearing the cheering crowd. Inside, a clear, whispering voice that sounded like mine, only bigger, came up and said, "Use breaststroke legs." In those days, you could use breaststroke legs for butterfly, but I had never done this before and had only witnessed it once and didn't recall that person winning their race. Use breaststroke legs. It was louder. On your marks, get set, go! I dived in, gliding my body in a wave, gaining momentum, head out the water, breaststroke legs. I didn't stop to look at anyone else and couldn't hear anything other than the rhythm of my breathing. My arms were like paddles, up over my head to the front, down, pull, breaststroke legs, head up, inhale, repeat. It was perfect synchrony. I was cruising. And when I got to the end and tapped the wall and looked up and around me, first to the right and then to the left, I saw I had won the race. I couldn't believe it. I'd followed my instincts and won big. My victory was my own, and in that moment, I learned I could pull myself to a level I had not experienced before by listening to and trusting the voice inside that got louder when I shut out the noise of the world around me.
Beautiful. Wanza, a big part of your piece, of course, aside from the main part, which is the swimming, is your attitude towards spirituality. And as young as you are, when you won this race, you could see that. And you could see how this has been grounding in your life. You also discuss, I think we had this conversation earlier, you discuss engaging with your shadow self through emotions and grief. So how has acknowledging and integrating these shadow aspects changed your approach to personal challenges and your relationships with people?
So it's a work in progress and will be for the rest of my life is how I see it. You know, it's primary school. Musangari for me was really instrumental in developing my relationship with the divine, because there was something that would happen not only in the pool, but even in the chapel. When we'd go to chapel, I'd feel it. I'd walk into chapel and just feel a holiness about the place. And same thing with church, when we'd go to church on Sundays as a family. But I think the divine was a refuge for me because, you know, one misconception I think that people have is that, oh, you know, you must have lived this super privileged life, which I did. But I also experienced a lot of chaos inside of it. And so I would retreat into just communicating with God, which I viscerally felt, and I still do. And I've had that all through my life. So I can handle the wildest of challenges, and I have, because I've never let that go. Like, I've never let that go. Nobody can take that away from me, basically. You know, people can take away other things, but not my relationship with God, with the divine. And I allowed myself to define that, to explore it. So, you know, I used to go to church. I don't go to church anymore.
Why?
Because I would sort of find myself in church and be like, what are these guys talking about? You know, what are they talking about? How are they interpreting the gospel in this way? Or also just being put off from, you know, like, Kenya is such a holy Joe place. People are so, you know, religious, but crooked. You know, people are really cruel.
Be God.
Yeah, you know, in Jesus' name, they'll say. But so for me, I was like, this just doesn't resonate with me, and I have a direct relationship to God, which the elements, I really experienced that in the elements, water being one, but in forests, walking, like just being in nature. In terms of my relationships with people and the shadow, it's a work in progress because of my experience. For instance, mistrust is something that I really have to keep working on. Trust, you know, I can kind of be like, what is your actual agenda here? You know, and but I'm aware of it. So as soon as I have an experience, I journal. You know, for me, it's journaling, it's meditation. I'll unpack what was happening there, what was I feeling, where do I feel it in my body, what do I have to release, what do I have to process. And actually, I also find that it's a wholesome way to live. I like it, yeah.
Your story comes full circle in part 3. And I mean, you've touched on this when you're giving the synopsis. So in part 3, what happens is that you describe your deliberate decision to reconnect with swimming as a means of self-disruption, self-discovery, and healing. Now, could you just expand more on how swimming continues to influence your outlook on life?
So going back to the pool was after my parents died. And because this is sub judice, got an ongoing court case, I can't get into that too much. But, well, let's just say that 12 years later today, I've never received a share of my parents' estates. And so I cut off, when I kind of realized what was going on, I cut off from my 5 siblings, all of them. So it was a very isolating experience and a very isolating time, but the betrayal that I felt and the injustice that I felt just had me sort of decide, okay, I've got to now create a life. I mean, so drastic, you know, this is my family, it's a well-known family, so a lot of social relationships gone. It just, I found myself in a very inward place, you know. But again, as I said, I've never quite been alone because God has always been with me. So my decision to go back to the pool was because inside of this cutoff, it was almost as if my father built a hotel, Windsor Golf Hotel and Country Club, and Windsor was like a second home. So with this cutoff, now I wasn't going to Windsor, and it had been years, like a very abrupt end. When I decided to disrupt myself, I was like, I need to disrupt myself to be my dad's daughter, because in a way, with this cutoff, not going to Windsor, not participating in anything family, it was almost as if, I might as well be from another family. But my relationship with my dad and I were really, really close. And I was like, I'm going back to be his daughter. That is justification enough for me to go back. So the return was to the pool, because the pool was the place that I always hung out. That's where we'd sit and have lunch. But again, I was going back to swim. I was going back to the pool. And in that process, I talk about the breathing, and how breath work brings up emotion. Swimming laps in that pool just brought up what I was actually feeling around not just my siblings, my father dying, my mother dying, like loss, isolation, all of it, very clearly, so I could write about it. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm glad you brought out the estrangement bit, because it happens to be a big theme in your piece with siblings, with family, with people generally, especially after the loss of your parents. So my question is, how has writing about these experiences influenced your perspective on family, forgiveness, and reconciliation?
So first of all, this piece is so important to me because coming from a family like mine, it's almost like you're not allowed to reveal. You're not allowed to talk about what goes on. And it gave me that opportunity to. I've been writing about this, journaling. I mean, I've got stacks of journals, but I couldn't write about it, even really talk about it, As I said, there's a court case, sub judice, you cannot talk about it. So my thing was, how can I be living life in my experience be an unknown? I mean, it's like a double injustice. I'm like, if I died today, then nobody would ever know. And so writing, was sort of like the solution to that. I'm a family business coach, consultant, and advisor. This whole experience basically created a career for me because, I mean, you can tell me the most horrific story of family dynamics and I'll believe you, And a lot of advisors don't, You might be sitting there and they're sort of looking at you like, you brat, how dare you come here and claim, that you've been suffering. But it happens, it's true, it's real. So I studied family dynamics. I really got into it. And forgiveness inside of family dynamics is sort of like a thing that I've done from a distance up to now. I've kind of been like, I forgive you. And I've had this conversation actually with my siblings, but a very strange, the other side has to be ready to hear what you have to say. But to forgive is kind of like, yeah, this is not, I'm not going to hold this against you. We need to work something out here. But you may not have that opportunity, It's just the way life goes. You might not. So I treat forgiveness as something that you literally really do it for yourself. It's like, I'm not going to hold this against you. I'm not going to keep bitterness in my heart for you. But it also doesn't mean that you say, so you can do whatever you want. It's made me stronger, actually. I think it's made me understand life better. I had a very naive view of life. Even just the whole, it's either good or bad. No, it's beyond duality. Life is just a mystery. It's mysterious. And I think what I've learned from this process was you just flow. You just flow with life as best as you can. I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress, I can be jarred by things, but then I'll come back to, I can also just let this slide. And it's just a path. It's a way that I've chosen to live life. I sort of think about life in terms of energy, and in an environment like Kenya, which is super transactional, super, care, concern, like people, it's like those things have just been taken over by how much, what is the value, what can I get out of something? So this approach helps me navigate life, and I'm still learning. I'm still learning.
Beautiful. Thank you, Wanja. The next writer's work, or works rather, also rely heavily on memory. Dale, going back to government quarters, could you give us a quick synopsis of your piece and a quick reading?
Thank you, Mami. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Dale Abraham. I am from Marsabit. I've written about growing up in a government-provided staff quarters in the 90s, early 2000s. And I think when we moved to these government quarters, it looked like moving into some kind of privilege. But using Marsabit and privilege in the same sentence looks like an oversell, right? But then I think we bought into some kind of illusion of privilege. The idea that, say, for a long time, these staff quarters, government-provided quarters, had been places of privilege. If you read African novels, especially from the 60s and 70s, there are places where kids went to very good schools, jacarandas, of course. There are cars that pick children from home and took them to school. But by the 90s, I think that dream had kind of fizzled out. We'd moved into these. A lot of people looking from the outside into the government quarters thought, those ones are like kind of exclusive society of sorts. A place where some kind of softer silence, polite innocence of certain kind was there. But even now, I feel many privileged spaces are very quiet places. But this quietness, I think, is a lack of people not saying enough. I think that silence is where some kind of violence, deep-lying violence lasts. So I think this is a kind of reflection and just thinking back about that. The expansive, eternally present and mystical forest beyond the road behind our house held an enchanting allure for us, boys coming of age. It served the role of a playfield, a private sanctuary, and a store of endless mysteries. Some days, elephants roamed between the houses. Some afternoon, as we played in front of the house, a pair of beautiful antelopes emerged, calmly grazing to our door fronts. Some nights you could see the glaring eyes of some animal in the bush across the ditch. During daytime, as the mystery lasted, we ran carelessly in the bowels of the forest, tarzaning from branch to branch. At night, the shadows were deep and baboon backs urgent. The baboons, as if in search of comfort, moved to the line of grevillea trees at the end of the third wooden cabin. You could smell their presence as you passed near those trees. The wood cabins brought both love and fear, and an in-betweenness of experiencing the nearby forest peacefulness and the chaos of the hospital wards. We soon learned that our house was referred to as condemned, a name that came to us in a slow, ebbing way, lapping on our own dreamscape, synonymous with a word that could itself be a prison. The rumors milling around condemned made our stay uncertain. It is up for demolition. It isn't fit for human habitation. It's not up to standard for government quarters. My parents plugged their ears to these cries but couldn't escape the uncertain night. The neighborhood transformed before my eyes into a chessboard as I made comparisons between our cabin and the other houses. The place was a bounded space of class orientation with physical and socially established hierarchies. These were apportioned in the number of rooms per house, or whether the houses were part of a line, or whether they were standalone, or whether they had their own compounds. One could see starkly the order of households as demarcated by its own hierarchies in its trash dump. Weetabix packets, Zesta and Blue Band containers, and Quencher bottles spoke the unsaid. And yet the condemned wooden cabins were leagues ahead of houses in other government quarters, like say the prison quarters where my schoolmate, Ben and his 3 beautiful older sisters lived. Their 1-bedroom dwelling had not been designed for a family, but for a transient bachelor. Yes, they believed they were better off because their neighbors lived in crumbling mud and wattle 1-room houses. The prison had been established in 1930 when our town had not yet celebrated its 20th year. Its quarters hadn't changed much in the 60-odd years it had sheltered the prison wardens. In all the neighborhoods, the bosses weren't a distant or invisible force. They walked along the same roads, but they were taciturn as if privilege was always meant to be a world apart. They locked their doors and stayed indoors. When they were seen coming from the far end, we stopped our games. Some women walked back into their houses. Everyone shared the same worries and were equally affected by the tanking economy and were subject of the same experiments. In our house, every evening, there was a renewed silence and a fear you couldn't exactly put a finger on, sprawled carelessly on our coffee table. The endless evolution of the public and private lives were transmuted to us children by the subtle silences of our parents. Even in a remote and provincial town like Marsabit, International Monetary Fund, experimental policies such as the structural adjustment programs met real-life survival concerns. Whatever was going on in the corridors of power in Nairobi, a capital which was a 2-day lorry ride away on an untarmac road, played out in the shape of the shadows or the textures of the silences in the neighborhood. Today you could be living in the staff quarters, tomorrow you'll be packing your bags going for early retirement, a euphemism for being retrenched, the golden handshake.
Amazing. That part right there that you just concluded with, it's one of my favorite parts in the story when you write how those IMF experimental policies, such as the structural adjustment programs, when they met real life survival concerns and how whatever was going on in the corridors of power here in Nairobi played out in the shape of the shadows or the textures of silences and anxieties in the remote provincial town of Marsabit. Could you just expand a bit and elaborate on how these macroeconomic policies translated into tangible anxieties and challenges at both the individual and the community level?
Quite a complex question. I hope I'll answer it. So
You got this.
I think, so the silences and the whispers were things that you thought was a baked-in idea of these kind of neighborhoods. But then you grow up, you read books like, say, Ivona Diambo mentioning silences as a 3rd language in this country, but it doesn't still kind of resonate deeply with you. You think this is supposed to be the silence of the state, for example, for what it does to people, to communities, to regions. But then the most important of these silences are those ones which you see your parents kind of not saying things or whispering certain things. And it gets some kind of very immediate, visceral immediacy of sorts. I think writing this piece for me has been a study of what these silences have been and how they, from the state level down to the household level, how people engage with the larger politics within their own environments and how these policies also shape, how the household level relates with each other, what is said and what is left unsaid. Yeah.
And the other thing that you touched on is also the social stratification within those government quarters. In the quintessential Dalo wittiness, those of you who've read Dalo's works, you know what I'm talking about. You write how, those Weetabix packets and Zesta and Blue Band containers and Quencher bottles spoke the unsaid, right? So the question is, how do you see this class and social hierarchies playing out in today's Marsabit, post-devolution Marsabit?
I think some certain kind of illusion has fallen in Kenya, and very interesting things are happening in the old villages that we used to kind of look down upon. those are the spaces that are thriving, becoming very important cultural markers where good music comes from, where people are more freer, sleep easily, laugh genuinely, than say the quarters that we moved into, where hierarchies of sorts were there. You know, like when you know that's your dad's boss, and he lives in his own compound, and you guys are living in a line of houses. But also thinking about how these kind of hierarchies are embedded in the regions and landscapes. I mean, like when you travel across this country, even now, those residential areas, government provided spaces are still there. And you see them as places where, you know, like the roof, the iron sheets are completely rusted. Now there are appendages of certain kinds, iron sheet appendages to those houses. I mean, they've been taken over. Guys, some have refused to move out of them. We've seen how the police officers live in this country, prison quarters. I think it's some kind of shame now that is often shown on TVs, where government residential quarters are not the thing they used to be in, say, in the 70s or 60s. I think now it's more a marker of poverty more than of privilege to be in such quarters. Yeah, yeah. And I don't mean this in a way to disparage the way people are living. Still means so much that I think those houses are still not available for so many people. But I think it's an illusion that that has fallen. Yeah.
Yeah. When we spoke last night about your story, there's something interesting that a story that you mentioned, and I want you to share this with the audience. Right now when you're reading it, you mentioned, your house, the house that your mom and your dad moved into, being referred to as a condemned house, and it was marked to be demolished or something. And from that the word condemned, that's how this whole story came up.
So every story has a story. The story of this story basically begins like this. I'm at a car wash in Marsabit, Java place. Guys are just milling around on a bigger story, right? So this guy tells me his experience of being jailed at Kamiti. And he mentions H block, condemned, where the condemned are imprisoned. And when he said condemned, that word instantly kind of teleported me back to a neighborhood that I had completely kind of shut off. I'd forgotten about it. We'd moved out for a long time. But then I remembered the first time I had condemned was basically a reference to the kind of houses we were living in. And so immediately I kind of stopped everything and started writing this story, right? It's just titled Condemned, Dead, and then I started writing the things that stood out for me then. And then I visited these quarters. Surprise, surprise. The condemned quarters are still there.
Still standing.
Yeah, so I think there was also like other politics to it. When they say this is up for demolition, it was a kind of creating some kind of disturbance in one's head so that if you move out, someone else takes it up. So I don't know whether it was really condemned. I mean, even now, 20 plus years, the place is still there. The house still there, more crumbling, more decaying, a lot of decline. But then the wood used to be oil soaked and it used to be black. There were all these jacaranda trees, very tall grevillea trees. Now it's even more colorful. I mean, someone's painted it different colors. So that's the story of how I went back. And sadly for me, there are people who, when I was there, now slightly like guys in their middle age who are still within those quarters. And I think it's much more a story of entrapment. I think people getting stuck in some kind of illusion of privilege, and the silences still reign, right? Yeah.
So, So all writers in the house, take note. Eavesdrop as much as you can. You can come up with a story. The next writer, Hadassah, please tell us what your story is about and the first reading.
I'm 28 years old, but But most days I feel like a 3-year-old. That's because I think of my life in two parts as it is right now. There's a before and an after. There are many possibilities, many opportunities, but I got to a place and I didn't know who is this Hadassah? This person I want to give opportunities. This person I want to give the world to. Who is she? So this story is my story. It's Hadassah. Yeah. The last time I tried to kill myself, I was 25 years old. I stood on a ledge 9 floors from the ground, staring into the abyss that was my life. It called to me as it always did, taunting with memories of all the things I should have, could have, or would have done better. Powerless to do much else, I stood there, taking it all in, letting shame and regret weigh me down. Maybe if I stood there long enough, the weight would be weighty enough to send me over the edge. I was up to my ears in shit. Nothing in my life was working. It seemed like I was standing still while everyone else and their deadbeat uncle moved forward. Months earlier, a therapist I was seeing had broken the news to me. I was clinically depressed with signs of dissociative disorder. I'd laughed in her face. Sure, I hadn't been happy in a long time, but wasn't that normal? No, it's not, she'd said with little bemusement. Not to the level of sadness you're at anyway. If you're willing, I can book you in for a weekly session. If it were completely up to me, I wouldn't have taken up the offer, but I felt obligated to do so because of the number of bodies involved. My college professor, out of concern, had called me in to find out why I hadn't submitted anything for review, even as the deadline for turning in my final year project closed in. He worried I wouldn't graduate. It would be such a crying shame, he'd said. I was quiet. I couldn't find words to express the tangled mess swirling in my mind. He took it for discomfort. He was male and much older. Maybe he wasn't the right person to handle this. He excused himself, and as he was leaving the room, asked that I wait there. In a bit, I'd learned that he'd gone to call for backup.
Isn't that beautiful? It's gripping, is what it is. Like you did that first sentence, and it was like, okay, I'm stopping everything I'm doing, and I'm reading this. And it takes a ridiculous level of vulnerability to share such a personal and painful story with the public, with the world. Where did you get the strength and the courage to write such a powerful piece?
I felt like I can't move forward without knowing what I've been through, because I'd never given myself a chance. But 3 years ago, clearly I didn't die because I'm here. So, but when thank you. But when I decided to leave, I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question is, where did you get the courage to
right.
write the story?
When I decided to leave, I decided to give myself a chance because I felt like that was the thing that was keeping me, that was holding me back. I didn't listen to myself. I didn't care about myself. I was always taking other people's opinions over my own. So there was that. I had made a decision to give myself a chance with this second life. And then the editor made it a very safe space. I also drew strength from that. But also, if I may add, I also wanted, because I feel like my story, if you take off some few things, if you don't look at the circumstances, you just look at the feelings, I feel like it's something everyone can relate to. It's just common things, but we don't talk about it. And I feel like if we'd have been more open, maybe it wouldn't have gone for me the way it did. So there was also some sense of responsibility, social responsibility, because I've already gone through it and I'm overcoming it. So if there's just one more person who can make different choices from hearing my story, I also wanted to be part of it.
You answered my next question. When you signed my copy of the quarterly, this is what you wrote. You said, Mohammed, when you have the choice to fight or flee, I hope you choose yourself. Yes. And I found that so encouraging and in a way, relating to your story, a story that transitions from a narrative of despair to one of hope. So thank you for that. I'm going to go back a bit. Throughout the story, you grappled with feelings of invisibility, inadequacy, being misunderstood. And then here you are, 25 years old, overwhelmed and pushed to a breaking point. You decide that this is it, and you went all the way to the ninth floor and you stood on a ledge. And just before you jumped, you heard a voice. And there was this dialogue that ensued in your mind. And thanks to that moment of hesitation, we are honored to have you grace our presence, and we are honored to read your powerful story. So the question is, in the aftermath of all of this, of deciding to live, how do you continue to find purpose and meaning in life, and how do you continue to heal?
I've taken time to discover. I didn't even know what kind of things I liked. I didn't know what I could tolerate. I didn't know my limits. I knew nothing. I'd stayed with myself for 25 years, but I knew nothing. So trying to get in touch with myself, trying to find out the kind of things that give me meaning, that has helped. It has helped a lot. Saying yes to a lot of things, exposing myself, because that was the problem before. I was closed off, completely isolated, closed off. So opening myself, letting the light in, letting my own light out, and seeing it. Like in this case, I've had feedback from this, and it gives me, at least even if it won't take me too far, it will take me to the next breath, the next step, the next day, step by step.
Amazing. Now, there's you and there's also another writer who've been so brave in writing about heavy traumatic experiences. I mean, not just the two of you, but your two stories are the ones that are really heavy. And the thing with writing about personal trauma is that it can be cathartic and therapeutic, but it can also be, re-traumatizing if you're not careful with that. So how did you navigate these emotional challenges during the writing process? How did you prepare yourself emotionally to revisit these, if I may use the word, dark moments?
There wasn't, I'm like Asha, there's not an intelligent answer for that. But my editor asked me to think of it this way. He said, just write. We don't have, just assume we're not publishing this story. Write it for yourself first, read it, and then we'll figure out what next. So in my mind, I wasn't writing for other people. I wasn't even writing for it to be published. It was just kind of like taking out what's inside me and putting it out there and looking at it. I'm like, oh, okay, so this is what is in me. This is what I have. Yeah, so it wasn't too hard once I got into that space. Getting there might have been hard, but yeah, once I did, I thought of it like I'm doing this for myself, just to see what I have inside me.
Amazing. The title, Now We Skate. Where did that title come from? How important was or is skating for you? Because in a way, skating did save you.
It did.
Yeah. So are there, what's your connection with skating right now? Or can you tell us how it saved your life?
I skateboarding. The first time I chose myself, it was for skateboarding. I was walking around. I'm sure I was depressed out of my mind. But I stumbled upon skateboarders, a group of skateboarders in Uhuru Park. And they were skating, they were falling. It was a messy affair. There was blood, there was sweat, they were dirty. But they would fall and they would get up, right? Their eyes, they just looked, it was stupid, to be honest. Like, why would you literally, it dropped you, you stepped on it and you fell and you're bleeding. Someone else has a twisted ankle, but you get up with your twisted ankle and you get back on it. Like, it didn't make sense to me, but I was envious. I found myself envious because I couldn't remember the last time I'd given myself that completely to anything. And I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be someone who gives wholeheartedly to something that I feel matters to me. So it was not an easy choice. If you read the story, you'll understand more. It was not an easy choice, but it was the first time I chose myself. It's been regrettably a bit of a while since I have been on a skateboard, but it's there in my room. I say it every day, and I'm grateful every day.
Amazing. I think so far the only writer we haven't heard from is Diana, who's to my left. Diana, let me say this before I start my quote-unquote complex questions. When I was reading your story, I was infuriated. I was sad. I was angry. I was emotional. In the Somali language, we say, when we see any form of oppression, we say, digo kumadaka komia, which means, yes. It means, doesn't your blood move? Like, doesn't your blood boil with rage for seeing oppression, right? And I must say, it takes a lot of courage and mental tenacity to write this. You and I had this conversation last night about how a lot has been written about you, ever since your story went viral. But you admitted that you didn't see yourself in those stories. And in a way, you weren't done justice. And you decided to take matters into your own hand, quite literally, and give us a powerful first-hand account of what went down. And I really want to thank you for trusting Debunk with your story. Could you kindly tell us, or give us a quick synopsis of what your story is about, and then we can go into the reading.
This is my first time doing this. Okay, having gone through my story for the first time and reading it over and over again, I feel like there's a lot more I should have written, but this is just like a summary of it. So my story is basically about how the death of my father led me into becoming a slave. I thought I was ready for this.
You can take your time. You can take your time.
I tried to explain how I ended up in that situation. A situation I was aware of it. I knew what happens in Saudi Arabia. I used to watch YouTubes I used to watch stories because I like documentaries a lot. So, in my story, it doesn't, I feel like it doesn't say so much about it, but I tried. I feel I should write another story. And being here today is the first time I'm owning my story, and it's the beginning of my healing journey, and it's beginning of a different Diana. I know out there everyone knows Diana, the girl from Saudi Arabia. But today sharing my story, owning my story is the beginning of a different journey, because deep down I feel I have a responsibility and my story was not in vain. I have a responsibility. There are other girls like me. There are other people out there like me whom like their stories never made it to the media like mine did. So today, it's a beginning of a different Diana. Hopefully, it will be Diana the activist. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Diana. You can take us through your first reading.
The flight was uneventful and the airline staff completely courteous. Much as I didn't ask for anything, there was a feeling that they would be helpful in case I needed to. Going by how politely they treated those in my vicinity. After sitting for what seemed like a pleasant eternity, I had wanted to stay awake for the entirety of their flight and taking in, but caught myself a number of times catching 40 wings. We finally landed and disembarked, and we were met by friendly Saudi immigration officials. At arrivals, our Saudi agents gave each one of the girls a red rose, a fitting welcome into the land of milk and honey. That was my first time receiving a rose flower. The pandemic was still on, and the countries were still cautious. We were driven to a hotel for quarantine for 7 days. On the shuttle ride, I took in as much of Riyadh as I could. Skyscrapers, wide spotless streets, luxurious residential and commercial districts. Soon I would get some days off and tour the streets of Riyadh. I thought to myself. Post-quarantine, I was driven to my employer's 3-story home. I was being employed by a man who wanted me to take care of his daughter and her daughter, his granddaughter. All I can say is the family seemed powerful and well connected, and the man's granddaughter was never to be called by her name, but by a title which conveyed that she was royalty. I followed the rules. The first thing my host did, even before I could settle in properly, was to ask for my passport, which they confiscated. I felt like resisting, but looking around, I remembered I was at the mercy of Saudis. In their own house, in their own country. I started feeling like an early day character in those horror Saudi stories. With your passport confiscated, you either run away and get arrested and deported, or endure suffering and humiliation until the contract, which will be altered by the employer, wasn't necessarily binding, like in my case, was over. Or maybe I was overthinking. There was another African lady working in my employer's home, and in staying true to our sisterhood, she did everything she could to see that I found my footing. However, beyond that, this is the bathroom, this is the kitchen bits, and the standard, do not answer them back when they speak. I was generally supposed to find my own way. And this is where things got slippery very fast. Our hosts had been sold the lie that all the girls who were making it the trip to Riyadh had previously worked in Saudi Arabia. And so the expectation was that I, just like any of the other girls, already knew the drill, whatever that drill was. Of course, there were cultural and religious differences. Our hosts were Arab Muslims, and a lot of us girls were neither, meaning there existed major and minor differences ranging from cuisine to beliefs to mannerisms. That there was an expectation for me to be of certain orientations or be in possession of certain skills out of my presumed prior stay in Saudi meant I was starting from a place of disadvantage. A clash of expectation which occurred immediately. As I found my way around the home, I quickly picked up that the madam, my boss and employer and henceforth, always slept during the day and was awake at night. This meant as much as I worked during the day, I needed to be on high alert after nightfall, since I could be called upon to attend to this, that, or the other at any minute. And so I slept with my clothes on, not wanting to risk being called upon and not responding immediately. Any kind of delay wasn't tolerated.
Powerful, very powerful, and very brave. What you went through, Diana, it's what's known as the kafala system that's used in majority, if not all, Middle Eastern countries, especially the Gulf countries. And this is a system that started in the 1950s when these countries began, bringing large numbers of foreign laborers to their countries under what is called a kafala program or a sponsorship program, where your employers bind you to a contract for a specified time period. It's slavery, let's call it what it is. From your perspective and your harrowing, heartbreaking experience, how does the kafala system facilitate the exploitation and abuse of migrant workers? And what specific aspects of this system, this horrible system that you went through, what specific aspects of this system make it particularly effective at trapping workers in those exploitative situations?
The agents, they just pick anyone who is in need of a job. It doesn't matter if you're educated, if you know where you're going, if you know the job you're going to do. So long as you are of age, you have a national ID, you are eligible. So you find you don't have the resources to travel, but you are in need of a job. You can't pay your own ticket. You can't facilitate your own passport. You don't have a good conduct certificate. Even sometimes there are some who don't even have their birth certificates. But once the agent does all that for you, that is the first step of being in bondage. Because I remember in my case, initially, when I left home to come to Nairobi, my plan wasn't to travel to Saudi Arabia. I thought I was traveling to Qatar. That's what I was told. So I went in, there are 2 medical tests you have to do, and that is money used. There's a small medical and a big medical. So once you go through those 2 medical tests, that is money used. You're already in bondage. And they already have your passport, they already have your ID. So when I learned that I was going to Saudi Arabia, I said, no, I don't want to go there. That is not where I was told I was going. So the agent sat me down and told me and kind of sweet-talked me into believing that Saudi Arabia was going to be a good place to work. And when I insisted, I said, no, I'm not going. Give me my passport and my ID. I want to go back home. I'm not going. Then they told me, then you have to pay us back the money that was used for medical. I didn't have that money. And that was the first bondage I got myself into. They used that to make me a bit softer, to be able to sit down and listen to what they were going to say. So I agreed to sit down and have a talk with them. And my agent promised me that wherever you're going, it's gonna be a safe space. Like those stories you have heard in the medias, those stories you have seen, they are stories of girls who went to illegal agents who are not registered. I was told you are going to a registered agency and you'll be safe. So, nikaingia box. So,
Yeah, I couldn't explain it any better. Like no one could say, because we read Diana's story. We saw Diana's story everywhere. It went viral on socials, on news articles, everywhere. But when I first saw it and when I first read it, I was like, yes, now the story has been done justice. And given the explanation that you've given us of the whole kafala system and everything that you went through, I feel like now there's that catharsis that you've been looking for. I'll follow that up with a question of, you said this is a rebirth of Diana the activist. So what changes do you believe are necessary at both the national and international levels to protect individuals in similar situations? Because there are many who are still trapped in these situations. So is there any message that you'd like to convey, say, to policymakers to preemptively address and mitigate such risks? I ask this because, especially now that we have a government that's so eager and keen to send Kenyans abroad as laborers.
personally, I feel like there's a lot that has to be done. There's a lot of work. And that work has to start with me creating awareness. That's the first thing. And the second thing is our government, it's in a way, that's how I felt personally. It didn't really care. The moment you cross the border, that is between you, your employer, and your God. That is it. No one follows up to know what is going on the other side. No one follows up to know if everything is okay. And when you make a distress call, no one actually follows up. And in my own opinion, I would say if only the government would be keen enough to follow up on its people. Even we have a lot of stories out there in the media, a lot of stories of our girls suffering, but there's no keen follow-up that is done. The moment you travel, there should be a way they can trace you and know your well-being. How are you doing? How is everything there? Are you okay? Are you being paid well? Are you being treated well? Is your employer abiding to the contract and the rules that are in the contract and everything that is in there? Is your employer abiding by it? And another thing, the agents. We have a lot of agents out there here. There are very many. And okay, I did a small research. In a number of them, they're not registered. But you wonder, like, how is it that they're able to take girls across the border? Because you cannot travel without a visa, a national passport. How is it that it's possible for an agent who is not registered to take people across the borders? That's one thing the government really needs to look into. And another thing, there's one thing my employer told me. She told me, like, there's nothing you can do. You have no power. This is my country. And I'm sorry to say, she told me, I can buy your government. Yeah. That was like the saddest thing I've ever had in my life. Someone telling you to your face that your country cannot save you, your own government cannot save you. And that, it sting hard. And okay, because I was there and I saw how other nations, how other governments are fighting for their own people. Just one phone call and the government is on the neck of those people, wanting to know what happened to their own. But in my case, it took like everyone making noise around social media and the governments, or okay, whoever is responsible, like waited long. The phone call I made, the plea I made, the request I made wasn't enough. They needed a lot of pushing for them to act. But I feel like the moment someone takes a call and says, I'm not okay, I need help, that is enough for one to go in and check. Because I remember, if the people or the agents in our government really cared, I didn't have to suffer for 14 months. Because I remember I made a call on my first month. I made a call. I said that things were not okay. And it was ignored. No one responded. No one followed up to check if everything was okay. Even after I went silent for like so long, no communication with the outside world, no one followed up. The agent went silent, and everyone went silent. And I think that is a responsibility. I'll put it on myself. I don't know how I'll do it, but I don't know how I'll do it, but I believe I'll be the voice. I'll be the awakening voice, so that whenever a phone call is made, whenever a cry of help is heard, it should be like taken seriously and someone follows up.
Amazing. It's been quite the honor for me to be on stage with these, ridiculously talented writers, to meet you all, to read you, and to talk to you. And this evening has been all about you, really. This evening has been for you and by you. And without your stories, we wouldn't be here. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you so much. Thank you for trusting Debunk with your stories, for taking your chances with Debunk, and for opening up what we believe is a writing and storytelling revolution in this part of the world. Asanteni sana, shukran jazilan. As I said earlier, I love my language. So adi ada umahatsintihin. That's thank you very much in Somali. I also wanted to share my gratitude with you, the audience. You have been fantastic by listening, of course, chiming in here and there. And thank you all so much for coming out this evening, for making this evening, this launch, this milestone in the Debunk story and in the chapter of African storytelling a success. We hope to see you every quarter because we are committed to publishing quarterly. We hope to see some of you in the coming Debunk quarterlies. And we hope to see some of you on this stage in the next couple of months or any other stage that we'll select. So please pitch your stories, follow us on social media at Debunk Media to know whenever we do our call-outs. And allow me to end a very special evening with a very cliche poem, tomorrow being Valentine's and all. Roses are red, violets are blue, Debunk quarterly is out, so please buy a copy or two. Thank you so much.